I stood at the edge of the pond, my heart racing as the argument with Ethan spiraled out of control. His words were sharp, filled with a rage I barely recognized. Before I could say another word, he suddenly shoved me with a force fueled by rage, and I lost my balance. As I tumbled backward into the cold, dark water, panic surged through me as I struggled to breathe, the weight of my unborn child pulling me under. My name is Sarah Miller, and I never imagined my life would spiral into such chaos. I'm a 30-year-old freelance photographer living in suburban Chicago. I'm 8 months pregnant with my first child, and the man who just shoved me into that pond is my husband, Ethan Miller. We weren't always like this. 5 years ago, Ethan was everything I could have dreamed of, a charming, ambitious real estate developer with big plans for the future. I was drawn to his confidence and the way he always seemed to know what he wanted. We got married after just a year of dating, and at first, our life together was nothing short of perfect. We bought a beautiful home in a quiet neighborhood. I built my photography business from home, and Ethan's career as a real estate developer flourished. We dreamed of starting a family, and for years, that dream felt close. But as time went on, things began to change. Ethan's work became more stressful, and the charming, easygoing man I had fallen in love with seemed to disappear. His temper flared more often, and small disagreements turned into full-blown arguments. He started blaming me for things beyond my control, like the market fluctuations that hurt his business or his long hours that drained him. When we finally found out I was pregnant, I thought it would be the beginning of a new, happier chapter in our lives. But I was wrong. Ethan's frustration only grew as my pregnancy progressed. At first, he pretended to be excited, telling me how wonderful it would be to start a family. But behind those words, I could feel the tension in the air. Every time he came home, it was like walking on eggshells, waiting for the explosion. He started coming home later, his face tight with anger, refusing to talk about work or anything related to the baby. I did my best to keep things together, but nothing I said or did seemed to ease his mood. One evening, as I sat on the couch, gently rubbing my growing belly, I realized how far apart we had grown. Ethan was sitting across the room, staring at his phone, barely acknowledging my presence. I tried to strike up a conversation. "How was work today?" I asked cautiously. He didn't even look up. "Same as always," he muttered, his voice clipped. I sighed, feeling the familiar pang of disappointment. "I know it's been hard, Ethan, but we're in this together. The baby's coming soon. I just want us to." "To what, Sarah?" he interrupted, finally looking at me with eyes full of disdain. "Do you think everything's going to magically get better once the baby's here? Because it won't. In fact, it's going to get worse. A lot worse." I blinked, stunned by the harshness in his voice. "Ethan, I'm just trying to help. We can get through this together, Ife." "Stop saying that," he shouted, standing up abruptly. "You're not helping, Sarah. You're making everything harder. I have enough to deal with at work. I don't need you constantly reminding me about this baby." His words cut deep, leaving me speechless. I didn't know what to say or how to make things better. All I knew was that the man standing before me wasn't the man I had married. As the months passed, the distance between us only grew wider. Ethan barely acknowledged my pregnancy, and every conversation turned into an argument. I had thought the arrival of our child would bring us closer, but instead it was tearing us apart. The night Ethan pushed me into the pond was the culmination of weeks of building tension. He came home late, his face dark with frustration. I could tell he had been drinking, something he rarely did. His movements were stiff, his eyes sharp with anger. I was sitting at the dining table, sorting through some baby clothes I had bought earlier that day. I looked up as he walked in. "Ethan, we need to talk," I said softly, knowing that avoiding the conversation wasn't helping either of us. "Talk about what, Sarah?" he slurred, his voice mocking. "About how you've ruined my life? About how I'm stuck in this mess because of you?" I froze, my heart racing. What are you talking about? He threw his keys onto the table, glaring at me. This baby, you. All of it. You've ruined everything, Sarah. I can't even think straight anymore because of you. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Ethan, I haven't ruined anything. This is our life, our baby. You need to calm down. Calm down? He snapped, his voice rising. Why should I calm down? You don't have to deal with the pressure, the stress. You sit at home, playing with your camera, while I'm out there, trying to hold everything together. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. Ethan, please, we need to talk about this before it gets worse. But he wasn't listening. Before I knew what was happening, he stormed past me and headed outside toward the backyard. I followed him, fear twisting in my gut. He was standing by the pond, his back to me, breathing heavily. Ethan, stop. Let's just go back inside and talk this through, I pleaded, my voice shaking. But when he turned to face me, his eyes were filled with rage. You know what, Sarah? Maybe you should take a good look at what you've done. Then, with one swift motion, he shoved me. I don't remember much after hitting the water. Everything was a blur of cold and panic. The neighbor who saved me, Mrs. Johnson, called the police. Ethan tried to downplay the incident, claiming I had slipped and he had tried to save me, but I knew the truth. The look in his eyes before he pushed me was seared into my memory. At the hospital, doctors checked both me and the baby. Miraculously, our child was unharmed, though the emotional toll was far greater. Ethan was arrested, and a restraining order was issued, but that night by the pond marked the end of our marriage. In the days following the incident, everything felt surreal. I had never imagined that my life would unravel this way. I had loved Ethan, or at least the version of him I thought I knew. But that man was gone, replaced by someone I no longer recognized. After being discharged from the hospital, I moved in with my sister Rachel. She had always been my rock, and as soon as she heard what had happened, she didn't hesitate to offer me a place to stay. Her home became a sanctuary for me, a place where I could focus on healing and preparing for the baby's arrival. The legal process was exhausting. Ethan's lawyers tried to paint me as an unfit mother, claiming that my emotional state had led to an accident at the pond. But the evidence was stacked against him. My neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, had witnessed the entire event, and her testimony, along with the restraining order, worked in my favor. After a grueling court battle, I was granted full custody of our child, and Ethan was ordered to attend therapy and anger management classes. He wasn't allowed any contact with me or the baby without court approval. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. I could finally breathe again without the weight of Ethan's anger pressing down on me. But I knew the journey wasn't over. I still had to rebuild my life from the ground up, not just for me, but for the child growing inside me. A few weeks later, I went into labor. It was a chaotic, emotional day, one filled with fear and excitement. Rachel was by my side the entire time, holding my hand as I breathed through the contractions. And after hours of labor, I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. The moment I held her in my arms, I felt an overwhelming wave of love and protectiveness. She was perfect, and I named her Ella, a symbol of light and hope in the darkest chapter of my life. Holding Ella in my arms for the first time, I realized just how much I had endured. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it seemed to fade in that moment as I looked at her tiny face, her little hands gripping my finger. This was the new beginning I had been waiting for, a fresh start for both of us. Rachel stayed with me through the early days of motherhood, helping with late-night feedings and diaper changes. As exhausted as I was, I felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, I knew we were safe. I was no longer walking on eggshells, and every day, as I watched Ella grow, I was reminded of the strength I had found within myself to leave a toxic situation and create a better future. As the weeks passed, I began to rebuild my life one step at a time. I threw myself back into my photography work, taking on small projects from home while caring for Ella. The flexibility of freelancing allowed me to focus on motherhood while also regaining a sense of independence. My clients were understanding, and slowly but surely, my business began to grow again. But it wasn't just work that needed rebuilding. Emotionally, I had to learn to trust myself again, to believe that I had made the right choices. The trauma of what Ethan had done lingered, but I refused to let it define me. I started attending therapy, working through the pain, and learning how to protect myself and my daughter from the past. There were days when I felt overwhelmed, when the weight of being a single mother hit me hard. But each time I looked at Ella's smiling face, I knew I had made the right decision. She was my reason for everything, and I promised myself that I would give her a life filled with love, stability, and happiness. Just as I was starting to find my footing, Ethan resurfaced. It had been months since the court case, and I hadn't heard from him since. He had complied with the court's orders, attending therapy and anger management, but I wasn't ready to face him, not yet. One day, as I was picking Ella up from daycare, I saw him. He was standing across the street, watching us. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct told me to run. But I couldn't, not with Ella in my arms. I turned quickly and got into the car, locking the doors before speeding away. That night, I called my lawyer. I needed to know what my options were. Ethan hadn't violated the restraining order, but his presence was enough to shake me to my core. I didn't want him anywhere near me or my daughter. The following week, Ethan's lawyer contacted mine. He was requesting supervised visitation with Ella. My heart sank at the thought. I had worked so hard to protect her from the chaos of his anger, and now he wanted to be part of her life. Legally, he had the right to ask, but emotionally, I wasn't ready to let him in. Ethan's request for supervised visitation sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't ready for this, not after everything that had happened. The mere thought of him being near Ella made my stomach turn, but I knew the law was on his side. Despite what he had done, he was still her father, and the court had allowed for the possibility of visitation, provided it was under strict supervision. My lawyer, Christine, was understanding. She had handled cases like mine before and knew how difficult it was for me to even entertain the idea of letting Ethan back into our lives, but she was realistic. "Sarah, I know this is hard, but the court will want to give him a chance, especially if he's completed his anger management courses and therapy. The fact that he hasn't violated the restraining order gives him some leverage," she explained, her tone gentle yet firm. "But we can fight for the most restrictive conditions possible, supervised visits only, in a neutral location. You don't have to be present if you don't want to." I sat in her office, my hands trembling in my lap as I processed her words. The idea of Ethan seeing Ella, even under supervision, made my skin crawl. But I also knew that if I didn't agree, it could make me look uncooperative in the eyes of the court, which could work against me later on. I don't trust him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if he loses his temper again? What if he tries to hurt her?" Christine nodded, her eyes filled with sympathy. "That's why we'll insist on professional supervision. He won't be alone with her at any point. And if he steps out of line, the visits can be terminated immediately." It wasn't the reassurance I wanted, but it was the best I could hope for. A week later, the first supervised visit was scheduled. It took place at a child visitation center, a sterile, neutral space designed to ensure safety during these emotionally charged meetings. Ella, of course, was too young to understand what was happening. At barely 9 months old, she was a happy, bubbly baby, completely unaware of the tension surrounding her. I didn't go to the visit myself. I couldn't bear to see Ethan, not after everything he had done. Instead, I waited anxiously at Rachel's house, pacing back and forth, constantly checking my phone for updates. When the visit was over, Christine called me. "Everything went smoothly," she said. "Ethan was cooperative. and the supervisor reported no incidents. Ella was safe the whole time. I exhaled the breath I didn't realize I had been holding, a mix of relief and frustration washing over me. I hated that I had to share my daughter with a man who had once tried to hurt me, but at least for now, the visits were controlled. I reminded myself that Ella didn't need to know the full truth about her father, not yet, anyway. As far as she was concerned, he was just another person in her world, not someone capable of such harm. But deep down, I feared the day when she would be old enough to ask questions. Despite the turmoil of the visitation process, I continued to focus on rebuilding my life. My photography business was thriving more than ever, with new clients and projects pouring in. It gave me a sense of purpose and control, something that had been sorely lacking during my time with Ethan. I also continued therapy, working through the trauma of the past year. My therapist, Dr. Patel, helped me unpack the emotional weight I had been carrying, teaching me how to set boundaries and trust my instincts. I learned that it was okay to feel scared, but I didn't have to let fear control me. Most importantly, I realized that my priority was Ella, her safety, her happiness, her future. Ethan's presence remained a dark cloud on the horizon, but I refused to let it overshadow the progress I had made. The supervised visits continued, each one uneventful, but the court was closely monitoring his behavior. Ethan hadn't shown any signs of aggression during the visits, and the reports from the supervisors were always the same. He was calm, cooperative, and respectful of the boundaries in place. Part of me was relieved, but another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this calm was temporary, that the real Ethan, the one who had pushed me into that pond, was still lurking beneath the surface. Months passed, and Ethan's requests for more time with Ella grew more frequent. He began pushing for longer visits, asking for the supervision requirements to be relaxed. His lawyer argued that Ethan had proven himself to be a responsible father during the supervised visits, and that it was time to allow him more access. I was terrified. The thought of him having more time with her, unsupervised, was unbearable. I fought back, insisting that the supervision remain in place, but the court was beginning to lean in his favor. After all, there had been no incidents during the visits, and Ethan had complied with all the court's requirements. One afternoon, after another hearing, I found myself face to face with Ethan for the first time since that night at the pond. He approached me as I was leaving the courthouse, his expression unreadable. "Sarah," he called out. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to speak to him, but something in his voice stopped me from walking away. "I just want to say, I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but I'm trying to be better. For Ella, for myself." I stared at him, my emotions a swirling storm. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to tell him that an apology wasn't enough, not after what he had put me through. But another part of me, the part that had once loved him, felt a small flicker of pity. "I don't care if you're sorry, Ethan," I said, my voice steady but cold. "You don't get to erase what you did with an apology. My only concern is Ella. Keep doing the right thing for her, and maybe, you'll get a second chance to be in her life." He nodded, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I will, I promise." The court eventually granted Ethan longer supervised visits, but I remained vigilant. I knew the risks, and I wasn't about to let my guard down. My focus remained on Ella and the future I was building for us, a future free from fear, filled with love and hope. In the end, I learned that strength doesn't always come from winning the battles we fight. Sometimes it comes from knowing when to walk away to protect what matters most. And as I looked at Ella, with her bright eyes and innocent smile, I knew I had made the right choice. This was the new chapter of our lives, one filled with resilience, growth, and unwavering love.